Hey everyone, welcome to this session about what is FPAS Mark III, where FPAS stands for Forecasting and Policy Analysis System, a system that premiered at banks like the Czech Central Bank, who uses Mark I, and then the Central Bank of Armenia, who, for example, uses Mark II. I'm your host, Joeri Schasfoort, ex-economic lecturer and founder of the online economics outlet Money and Macro Media. And today I have with me two amazingly experienced economists. The first is Doug Laxton, a Canadian economist and founder of Settlepoint Research, the Better Policy Project. And he used to be at the Bank of Canada and IMF. And he has worked with all of these central banks and many more to develop FPAS Mark I, Mark II. And then we also have Martin Weale, who is a professor of economics at King's College London, and he used to be an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England. And today, is to quote the famous Professor Charles Goodhart recently seems to have said, "I do not know a period as uncertain as the present," referring to the tariffs, of course. This is likely to get worse in the future as the new US tariffs are imposed on April 2nd, which is next week at the time of recording. So we really need certainty, and central bankers especially really need certainty. Frameworks can provide this. Doug, before we get into FPAS Mark III, can you maybe tell us a little bit about FPAS Mark I and Mark II?
Okay, sure. So the term FPAS is Forecasting and Policy Analysis System. And the very first central bank to use that term was the Reserve Bank of New Zealand when they published in 1998. So they started inflation targeting in 1990, and they didn't have a framework. They invited me there because I developed the framework at the Bank of Canada and effectively developed a plan with them over a week. And then several years later, in 1998, they unveiled this thing called a forecasting and policy analysis system. And the key idea in it was to recognize that it was more than a model, that it was a system of organizing the central bank's resources and so on. So, but the key basic assumptions of the framework was to think about where is the economy today, what are the underlying forces in the economy, and what do I need to do with my instruments to achieve my objectives. And at that point, we had gotten through the issues at the Bank of Canada about thinking about the expected path of the policy rate as being the thing that influences longer-term interest rates that are relevant for households and so on, and of course, importantly, the exchange rate. So the expected path of the policy rate is really the policy, the setting of the policy rate in a very short-term overnight market or two-week repo market, depending on the country, is almost irrelevant to most economic decision makers. It's the perception of where that policy rate is expected to go that determines the longer-term interest rates and so on. So the FPAS Mark I central banks recognize that, and in fact, it was like an infection. Once the Reserve Bank of New Zealand showed that this was possible, we then provided technical assistance to Latin America, Eastern Europe, Africa, all over Asia. And so now the vast majority of central banks are FPAS Mark I central banks. But we have some advanced economy central banks, interestingly enough, like the ECB and the Bank of Japan and the Bank of England, that are non-FPAS central banks that do not construct a consistent forecast where there's an endogenous interest rate path that's consistent with the longer term interest rates and things like the exchange rate and so on. So a lot of central banks were going that direction, and then what happened was, the global financial crisis, the European debt crisis, COVID. So we had all this uncertainty, and then we had the Central Bank of Armenia. After I'd retired, amusingly, after I'd retired and written a book on advancing the frontiers of monetary policy that took stock of the experiences of these FPAS Mark I central banks, right after I'd done that, they were then tested by the stagflationary implications of COVID-like shocks and so on. So this then prompted the Central Bank of Armenia to contact me and to say, do we need a different framework? So I wrote a paper, first paper on these issues with Chang Henri that we presented in Jackson Hole in 2022 that basically argued that we needed to have scenarios-based forward guidance. So we're critical of what they've done with monetary policy and advanced economies. I'm talking about the U.S., the euro area, and so on, because it had resulted in a massive asset price bubble. And so we're very concerned about using unconventional monetary policies that way because of these unintended consequences that I think we're still dealing with today. So we set off to design from scratch based on an institutional framework where the Armenians are responsible. So they have a board, and each one of those board members is individually accountable. Okay, so we needed to design a framework and develop the human capital where those policymakers would go through a process. It's called a 28-day cycle. Pretty efficient, actually, where basically it starts off where the policymakers tell the staff what are all the things that they're worried about. Okay, and this is documented in a one-pager. So there's a little bit of accountability there already. And then the staff have this one-pager from each one of the board members, and the chief economist then goes away and tries to write what he thinks is the best monetary policy report he can write. That includes, okay, importantly, a table that has a taxonomy of risks. Okay, so it's very comprehensive. The risks of the board, the risks that are identified by the board, the risks that are identified by the staff, and the risks that are identified from surveying the financial sector. So any risk that you think is really important, but it has to be put into a matrix where you can see what are difficult and what are easy kinds of risks. So it's basically exactly the same kind of chart that Ray Dalio uses when he thinks about portfolio management. Inflation on the vertical axis, growth on the horizontal axis. When you have a situation when you're in a stagflationary world, inflation's rising, like with tariffs today. Inflation's going to rise, output's going to fall. And unfortunately, sometimes you have to raise interest rates, but you're not sure. You're not sure whether or not the increase in prices from the tariff, is it temporary? Should you look through it? And so managing uncertainty was the whole design behind the development of this FPAS Mark II framework, where you create these different scenarios. Case A is one where, so the very first step in the process is creating a market reference scenario, because of course you need to know what is priced in financial markets. If you're going to be nudging those prices in financial markets, one needs to first start out with knowing what they actually are and what implications they have for the economy. And so a case A scenario is a path for the policy rate that is higher than what's currently priced in financial markets. A case B scenario is a path for the policy rate where interest rates are lower than what's priced in financial markets. And the idea is that by putting these case A and case B scenarios in front of the policymakers, so they don't come up with these case A and case Bs. Professional economists that have been trained do that. What those professional economists try to do, under the guidance of the chief economist, is to come up with case A and case B scenarios that the board members can relate to. But they might not encompass all of the ideas, but all of the ideas are in that risk matrix. So all of it is there. Now, so what happens? They then have a true policy meeting. What do I mean by true policy meeting? They have a meeting where they decide on the policy rate, where they haven't locked it in yesterday, but they actually decide on what it is. And of course, they then are extremely transparent in terms of the process that they went through to arrive at the arguments for that decision about the policy rate. And it always involves a narrative, in their mind, a case A and case B. Not the one that's published in the report, but a qualitative representation of their case A and case B. And, you know, that is the one pager that is eventually published now in a transparency report after the publication of the monetary policy report, which is published on the same day as the actual decision. So that's FPAS Mark II. What have been the experiences? In 2 weeks, Vosgen and Charles Goodhart will be here. Vosgen is the head of the production team that implements this, and Charles is just interested in how these frameworks are being developed, to deal with uncertainty and so on.
Yeah. Hey. Okay. And then Martin, you have experience at the Bank of England. How does this relate to the Bernanke report, which recently sort of came out about how Bank of England is going about things, and how does that overlap with these FPAS frameworks?
Well, the Bernanke report recommended that the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England should make more use of scenarios, and since last summer they have been talking about that. The two scenarios round the main projection that they're concerned about are either that inflation should fade faster than the central projection, or that wage and price cycles get triggered off and inflation is more of a problem than the main analysis suggests. So far they've limited themselves to saying, not surprisingly, that in the first case the interest rate will be lower and in the second case the interest rate will be higher. There was a question Bernanke faced or did address: should the Monetary Policy Committee produce any trajectory for the interest rate? And he was talking with reference to what the Federal Reserve Board do and their dot plots. I think he recognised that because the Monetary Policy Committee is smaller than the Federal Reserve Board or the Board of Governors, it might well be impossible to maintain the anonymity of the dot plots. And the sort of thing you could see happening would be, 2 or 3 external members of the Monetary Policy Committee would say quite precisely what their views were, and then the Treasury Committee, the body to which the Monetary Policy Committee reports, would ask the other members, and there'd be a lot of speculation about who had said what, whose dot was whose, and it could become rather awkward. So I think really for that reason Bernanke didn't recommend a dot plot. I think, relating it to the FPAS framework, one of the features of the forecast is that initially, when I joined the committee, we just produced forecasts for GDP and inflation. There was a lot of pressure from outsiders saying things like, what are you forecasting for consumers' expenditure? What are you forecasting for this or that? The Monetary Policy Committee didn't feel it was in a position to forecast those, but the solution adopted was to produce a table of variables consistent with the Monetary Policy Committee's forecast, but produced by the staff at the Bank of England. So the relevant table says, no, these are consistent with the Monetary Policy Committee's forecast, but the Monetary Policy Committee aren't responsible for them. And that was something that was started more than 10 years ago, and I think it's worked. No, members of the Monetary Policy Committee have been able to relate to these tables when they want to, and they've been able to ignore them when they want to. Now, the interesting question is whether the same thing could be done with interest rate paths, both consistent with the Monetary Policy Committee's forecast and for the two scenarios, if you like, the nice scenario and the nasty scenario. I suspect that's something that the Bank of England may be considering, but historically there has been a reluctance to produce an interest rate path associated with the Monetary Policy Committee's forecast, the argument being that the Monetary Policy Committee votes on interest rate policy. To have it voting on current interest rate policy can be complicated enough. How could you get it to vote on future interest rate policy as well? Now, in some cases there might be quite a lot of consensus, and it would be really straightforward. In other cases, and to some extent I think this depends on the personalities of the people on the committee, in other circumstances, there might be paths which would be repudiated by several of the members of the committee. In particular, the external members of the committee tend to be more vocal than the internal members, and I think that's really their function, or one of their functions. So the question would be, how far members of the committee felt comfortable with implicitly endorsing a staff forecast for the interest rate pattern which said no more than that this was consistent with the MPC's forecasts. I'm sure people, commentators would ask MPC members what they thought of the interest rate paths, shown in, say, two side scenarios and a main scenario. People would ask what committee members thought of those scenarios, and in some circumstances I can see they'd be thinking of my experience on the committee and the different people on the committee. In some circumstances there'd be general agreement. In other circumstances it would be another thing to be able to disagree about, and you might get fairly strong disagreement. So I suppose I am not sure how far the Bank of England will feel it can go in producing scenarios that actually show some assessment of how the Monetary Policy Committee would need to respond. And I say need to respond because its actual response, of course, might be rather different. It'll be interesting to see whether that does happen, but for the time being I think we need to keep watching this space. I think it would be difficult for the Monetary Policy Committee to give up responsibility for the inflation and growth forecasts and to say you rely entirely on a staff forecast, because if you look back at the history of the last nearly 30 years now, there has always been pressure on the Monetary Policy Committee to produce its own views and to say more about what it thinks is going to happen to the economy. So suddenly to say we're stopping doing that strikes me as rather unlikely. So I don't think we could move to an arrangement where the forecast as well as the scenarios are entirely staff forecasts. It may be a good idea, but I think politically it would be extremely difficult, to say the least.
Yeah, that makes sense given the history. Let's forget about that for a while. I'm just wondering, Martin, if you would if you take a hypothetical central bank that doesn't use any framework at all, would you say it makes sense to move to Mark II framework or do something in between, or what would you consider the best practice at the moment?
Well, I think it has to depend on the history of the central banks. I mean, we've talked about it in the context of the UK, but I think it's probably true more generally that the central bank independence was established in particular circumstances, and that's governed how the committees work. So some of them might feel able. I think there are two questions: is moving to FPAS Mark II, say, a good idea? And second, in purely economic terms, you can certainly make arguments for that. But the broader question, is it politically practical, I think probably depends on each central bank's situation and history.
Yeah. But okay, then this is why I'm asking the question. Is it a good idea if you don't have significant history?
Well, I think it's a framework which certainly has its appeal. I suppose the question is, what else does the central bank do? And to produce interest rate policy without any framework at all would seem to me an absurd thing to do. So a framework is needed. There may be others that would function as well as FPAS. I don't have a view on that, but some sort of structure is needed, and the FPAS framework is certainly quite a firm structure which is readily available and tested.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Martin. And I think that gives us the perfect time to talk about FPAS Mark III, because we haven't talked about that yet. Doug, you introduced Mark I, Mark II. What is Mark III? Why do we need it?
Well, this is actually a project that Martin and I are working on. So think of COVID. Inflation went way up. We brought inflation back to around 2%, and people were still unhappy because they care about the price level. In the case of the U.S., it was the price of eggs when they go to the grocery store and so on. So that is one of the motivations that maybe we should move closer to price stability. Now, this would depend on the country. So we're talking about small open economies. This would be more difficult in larger economies. But let me tell you what the progression of our research agenda is. On November 7, 2013, the Czech National Bank, having been stuck at the effective lower bound for a year because they were in the European debt crisis, came up with this FX intervention strategy. They were at the time an FPAS Mark I central bank, where they were obviously using an interest rate reaction function to generate a forecast. Let me tell you what that forecast meant for them. It was stated very clearly in the preamble of the monetary policy report that this forecast is drawn up by the monetary policy department. It is a very important input for monetary policy, but it is not the only input. But it is used as a very important frame of reference for talking about what the individual board members' views about monetary policy are. We published a paper called Czech Magic that actually reviewed how that expected path of the policy rate actually influenced longer-term interest rates after it was made available. And since the board, in many cases, would go along with the messages in the staff forecast, the revisions in market interest rates were in the direction that would be suggested by the expected path of the policy rate. But Czechs are a little bit special. There might be asymmetric information. The Czechs were obviously investing more in monitoring the economy than probably most other people in the Czech economy. Not true for the US, for example, where everybody has access to the same information and analysis and so on. Okay, so what happened? They ran into the effective lower bound, and they came up with this thing called an FX intervention strategy. And these intellectual ideas were, of course, drawn from Lars Svensson's foolproof approach for dealing with deflation issues. So they came up with an exchange rate floor, and of course this is foolproof, as Lars indicated. So what they did was a very practical implementation of what Lars was talking about, what his policy is foolproof. Came up with a floor for the exchange rate that depreciated by approximately 6%. And they said that we're going to treat this depreciation, this floor, as an instrument, never a target. Meaning, of course, that we're going to communicate how long we expect to be at this floor. And obviously, if the economic situation, the deflationary forces that we're facing, were to continue as they did, we are prepared to depreciate further, or we're prepared to keep this policy in effect for longer. The policy, the exchange rate, the Czech koruna depreciated through the exchange rate floor and was acting as a wonderful shock absorber. So despite the fact that the interest rate was at the policy rate was at the floor, the exchange rate would depreciate on bad days with bad economic news and would appreciate on days with good economic news, just exactly as it had between 2002 and 2013, where they had a completely floating exchange rate with no interventions and so on. So they achieved this exchange rate floor. It cost about 10 billion purchases of US dollar assets. Now, why did it work so well? One, they had a consistent framework, FPAS Mark I. All they were doing was finding another instrument to replace the policy space that was lost by being at the effective lower bound. They had no problem in their financial sector, and so it made no sense to purchase domestic assets. They knew that if you gave unlimited amounts, this is, of course, the third most important ingredient, is that legal authority to the central bank to purchase unlimited amounts of foreign assets. And this is what should make the model, this is what should make the policy super credible. In other words, if it was designed absolutely perfectly, you would not have to buy any foreign assets. If you're doing this policy because inflation's below the target, the economy is weak, and you want to get the future price level up. Now, the way the policy works, interestingly enough, through risk-adjusted UIP, is that if you can convince people that the price level is going to be higher in the future, that inflation is going to overshoot the target sufficiently, well, risk-adjusted UIP, even if you're at the effective lower bound, means the exchange rate in the future is going to depreciate, which means that the exchange rate depreciates today through arbitrage across periods and so on. So this is how it worked in the Czech National Bank. They did a pretty good job with the communication of the entrance, in other words, implementing the policy. Messed up a little bit in the sense that they made the policy effective right away on November 7th, 2013. They could have said, as I hope we would recommend in the future, that when you do something like this, you say it's going to be effective in 2 days, just to give the market a little bit of a chance to jump above the floor. That's a minor point, but it would be really, really nice because it would show the power of expectations when you're dealing with this, this super powerful bazooka that central banks possess when they have a framework and when they're in a situation where it makes sense for them to use that tool. Okay. Now, of course, the tricky thing, which I'm not going to talk about, which is the exit, and the Czechs messed that up, and so what we're going to do is try to write a paper talking about how you would actually do this and how you would manage the exit more effectively, but more importantly, how you would develop your framework. Now, what are the implications of this? The implications of this is that if you believe, as I do, the only reason that you're worried about the effect of lower bound, that could be costly because of falling into a costly, ongoing Fisherian deflation. So if you're worried about that, then you have to be worried about hitting the effect of lower bound and stuff. But if you can prevent that by having this super powerful tool of depreciating the exchange rate, and everybody in your economy knows that that's going to result in higher prices, particularly if you're prepared to say, if it doesn't work, we will depreciate further. So that policy is a natural thing for, I think, small open economies, and particularly economies that have experienced dollarization, because virtually no economy on the planet that has experienced dollarization, they always have a little bit of excessive dollarization. It never quite disappears. And so for those economies, going for price stability would have incredible advantages, because it would mean that all else equal, that your nominal exchange rate would be appreciating over time. And for those people that suffer from money illusion, it would look like your currency is something that is a good store of value and so on. But more importantly, it's being able to communicate monetary policy in terms of price stability. In other words, in an environment where this policy was successful, there would be less uncertainty in the future price level. We know from the COVID period that people were harmed from that surprise inflation, because not everyone gets to adjust their price. Many people, through convention or through the structure of markets, can only adjust their prices and their wages with a lag and so on. So that's why we had a cost of living crisis from the perspective of what monetary policy could do. So I think it would just be much more straightforward to communicate to real people. I'll maybe end on a bit of a joke, so that you understand my idea very clearly. My professor at grad school, he was sort of the Canadian version of Milton Friedman. So like he was a monetarist and stuff, right? And he decided to run for a seat in Parliament, and he ended up having a debate. And his name was Tom Crushane. And so anyway, Tom, who had written a book on inflation, imagine this town hall meeting, and he was telling everybody, this is inflation in the 1970s, that inflation is bad and blah 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 blah, and monetary too much money and blah blah blah, and his opposition guy said, "Who is this guy telling me about inflation? I go to the grocery store too. We all do." And he got a standing ovation. So, we need we need to have price stability. We need to have an example of a central bank can do this. Now, of course, advanced economy central banks, this is much more difficult in situations where you've got a bunch of economies. They all can't do this policy. But the question is, how small do you have to be? In other words, could Canada do this policy? Because when you think of the harm that's being imposed on Canada right now, this, for example, tariff on autos and stuff, that's going to be contractionary to the Canadian economy. If this problem were to get out of control, if we were to have if we were to prick the bubble in equity markets and the housing market in the United States, that would have, just like the global financial crisis, our banks were good. It was basically just an external demand shock. Well, what happens when you have a credible monetary framework like Canada, backed up by fiscal? Your exchange rate depreciates. So I think this, so the question is, how big do you have to be before you can consider this? Should Japan have used it? Had Japan used it decades ago and escaped from the effective lower bound, would it be a safer country today rather than running up a massive fiscal amount of debt? And of course, now that is held by, because of all these unconventional policies, by banks. And so those policies, resulted in potentially very harmful consequences in the future. And that problem could have been overcome by basically using Lars Benson's foolproof approach to eliminating a costly low inflation trap or potential deflationary trap. But
yeah,
so that's my view.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Yeah. So, Martin, you're working with Doug on this. How would you contrast Mark III? Like, what makes it? What would be the summary of what Doug just said? Essentially, like what would be the summary of how it's different from Mark I and Mark II, and then how would it work for let's say the UK, for example?
Well, my understanding of Mark III, and Doug will correct me on this, my understanding of Mark III is that you say not only what the reaction of the interest rate is to particular circumstances, but what the reaction of foreign exchange intervention will be in particular circumstances. So essentially I wouldn't quite say you communicate to the outside reader a policy rule, but you communicate a policy framework which is designed to address the kink that arises from the zero lower bound. I don't know whether, Doug, you'd agree with that summary rather.
Yeah, the only thing is that you said foreign exchange intervention. I would say foreign exchange rate intervention strategy, because I would just want to to emphasize that you're not just saying that you're going to be doing a bunch of interventions. The amount of interventions that are necessary don't even need to be calculated. It's completely irrelevant.
No, I very much take the point that with the credible threat of intervention, you never have to do it. Or at least you should never have to do it.
Yeah.
Now, how far that relates to the United Kingdom, the history in the UK has been against foreign exchange intervention. Typically, the problems have arisen from trying to support the currency rather than trying to weaken it, and the most spectacular was the loss of reserves completely on the day Britain left the ERM. No, there's never been a public inquiry into the costs of that to the taxpayer and why it happened, but there were substantial costs to the taxpayer because, of course, the reserves then had to be rebuilt at a less favourable exchange rate. So United Kingdom experience is focused on trying to support the currency, whereas here the framework is the other way round, that it's a framework in which you indicate you're prepared to depress the currency, even if, as I take Doug's point, you may never need to intervene. How receptive the UK would be to that, I think, remains to be seen. The Monetary Policy Committee was it was allocated £6 billion of foreign exchange reserves to allow it to intervene if necessary, but of course with the focus on supporting the currency, the question wasn't addressed, should the Monetary Policy Committee decide to add to those reserves rather than reduce the stock of reserves. So I think it's an open question, how far the Bank of England would be prepared to lap this up, but we'll only find out by asking them.
But do I then understand correctly, Doug, that this is just in normal circumstances, if you're not at the lower bound, then you just use the interest as under FPAS Mark I or Mark II, and then only if you're at the lower bound, this new tool kicks in. But then it's because you have the framework, it's clear that it will kick in.
Yeah, I mean, so you have to think about the economies where that's appropriate, right? Which is economies that believe in that flexible exchange rate, that have a credible, seasoned regime, okay, where the exchange rate's really acting nicely as a shock absorber. Okay, you can actually see risk-adjusted UIP, because a lot of the uncertainty has been eliminated from monetary policy and so on. So in those cases, you're not intervening, and what you're doing is using this incredible asymmetry that any credible central bank that's competent can depreciate. Okay, like nobody out there should question that if it's the case that they want the higher price level. So if they truly want to escape the low inflation trap or deflationary risk trap, then they can always depreciate. It's a fundamental thing about being able to purchase unlimited amounts of foreign assets. The other way doesn't work. Okay, it's very difficult. You can go through a lot of reserves very, very quickly if you're working against the fundamentals and stuff. To explain the importance of the framework, was Scott Bissett reminded me about Black, the day that they broke the Bank of England in, what year was it?
It's happened several times.
Well, this was 1990 when. So this
It
was
was 1992 when Britain left the ERM.
Okay, 1992. Sorry, I forgot. And so, what was really interesting about it, to contrast it to what I'm talking about here, is that they had an exchange rate band, okay, and they had floating rate mortgages and so on, right? So that's a case of a policy inconsistency, because if you're facing a housing boom and the exchange rate wants to appreciate, or the exchange rate wants to depreciate, how did it work? How did it work, Martin?
Well, I think it depends on what interest rates are doing. If the Bank of England puts interest rates up to suppress the housing boom, then the exchange rate would be likely to appreciate. If it decides that the housing boom doesn't matter because it's not affecting consumer prices, then I'd expect the exchange rate to depreciate.
Okay, so they were expecting that basically they couldn't withstand really high interest rates to keep the exchange rate in the
Indeed,
band.
yes.
So they
Yes.
shorted the exchange rate and made 20%. 20% in the one day where obviously it became unsustainable. The Bank of England couldn't raise interest rates because the effects would be so harmful on the economy. So that's an example where, the policy that we're talking about is in circumstances where it's appropriate, where you're using it to fill the policy space that's been lost by hitting the effective lower bound, only in those circumstances. Now, you could think of, and this is why this is going to be multiple papers and stuff. So Martin suggested that we could just go back initially to the Czech Republic and do a case study, just to go through what exactly, they did well, what they didn't do so well. And then in the next stage, to model it, much better up to 2025 standards, where we model like guys at the Fed model as a mixed complementarity problem, where we have an objective function for monetary policy and then a system for the economy, nonlinear equations that include things like endogenous policy credibility, so that we can really talk about the costs of getting stuck in a low inflation trap or a high inflation trap. Both are permissible and stuff. And then, of course, importantly, what makes a mixed complementarity problem really interesting is this occasionally binding constraint. So this kink where you hit the effective lower bound, and then this other condition where this FX intervention strategy, this exchange rate floor, comes into effect. Okay, so we need to have a loss function that explains what the objectives are in inflation and output, that decides at what point do you bring in the FX intervention strategy, and at what point do you exit from it. And is there a way, actually Martin was talking about smooth pasting and stuff, is there a way that can make the exit less tricky? Okay, because the entering that room is really easy, and managing it is easy, and the Czech showed that it works like magic. But the exit is more complicated, and the question is, can you think through, for example, what the appropriate level of transparency and ambiguity is? Because you're dealing with an FX market, and you have these guys like Scott Bissett that are there prepared to short you if you set up any sort of system where there's a one-sided bet, which is what precisely happened. What's it called? It was called Black something.
Black Wednesday.
Black Wednesday. Okay, sorry.
Except then people changed its name to White Wednesday because the framework established afterwards was easier for managing the economy.
Black and white.
Yes.
So anyway, it's been a wonderful pleasure. Martin and I have been working Mondays and Thursday mornings, basically effectively advising a couple of young researchers that do all the work. But
okay, I see. When can we expect the working paper?
Well, Martin's going on holidays, and I don't know when he gets back, I think.
Yes, well, that means late April at the earliest. But no promises, at least not on my part.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it, and I think it's it's definitely really thought-provoking to have, an FPAS Mark III where you take the exchange rate into the framework in certain circumstances, specifically if the interest rates are at the effective lower bound. And as I understand it, this is all just really inspired by what the Czechs did. And could it be seen as just a way to formalize essentially what they already did? Is that how I should see
partly.
it?
Yeah. I would say that they should deserve credit. Lars Svensson wrote that paper probably 2 decades before they did it, but it's also an example of somebody that came up with a great idea, and many institutions failed to understand the insight and learn from it. Because the whole story about interventions is messy business. Because most of the time it's stories about people trying to fight the fundamentals and losing all their reserves and so on. There's once in a while there's a story about where it seems to have worked and so on. But it's usually a pretty messy business. But this is an example of an FX intervention strategy that seems pretty well thought out in terms of its economics and the fact that a policymaking institution like the Czech National Bank would take these core principles and turn it into a practical implementation. So I agree 100%, Joeri, that this is partly us, trying to learn from their bold move to actually show that you could do something like this.
Yeah. All right. Thank you both so much, and I'm really looking forward to reading the working paper.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joeri.
Take care.
Martin.
Bye.